Washington, D.C. moved at its usual breakneck speed, but for Kayleigh McEnany, the morning was just another routine. The city's chaos never fazed her. She had faced far worse storms and had always come out standing. Today was supposed to be simple, a routine hearing, a business case she could argue in her sleep. She strode into the federal courthouse with quiet confidence, briefcase in one hand, the other adjusting the lapel of her blazer. The building's towering columns and polished marble floors reflected the sterile efficiency of the judicial system, a place where cases were decided by facts, not personal biases. Or so she thought. Kayleigh entered the courtroom, her heels clicking against the polished floor as she made her way to the defendant's table. She barely paid attention to the spectators, the clerk, or even the prosecution. It wasn't until she took her seat that she felt it. A pair of eyes. Cold, calculating, fixated. Judge Alan Prescott sat high on the bench, his fingers laced together as he observed her. Not her face, not her expression, but something just below her collarbone, the small gold cross pinned neatly against the fabric of her blazer. The air in the courtroom shifted. A subtle but unmistakable stillness settled in. Then, in a voice as sharp as a gavel's strike, Prescott cleared his throat. "Miss McEnany, before we begin, I must remind you, this is a courtroom, not a place for religious expression." A murmur rippled through the few people in attendance. Even the court reporter hesitated, fingers hovering over the keyboard. Kayleigh blinked, taken aback, not by the statement itself, but by the sheer audacity of it. "Your Honor?" she asked, keeping her tone even. Prescott leaned forward, his gaze never leaving the cross. "That symbol violates the neutrality of this court. You'll need to remove it or I'll have to issue a fine." The words hung in the air, heavy and deliberate. A fine for wearing a cross. The bailiff shifted uncomfortably. The clerk stole a quick glance at Kayleigh, then at the judge. No one spoke, no one moved. Kayleigh let out a slow breath, tilting her head slightly. "With all due respect, Your Honor," she said calmly, "this cross is no different than a wedding ring or a lapel pin." Prescott's expression remained unreadable. "That's not how I see it." He sighed, already looking exasperated. "Remove it, or the fine stands." Kayleigh didn't move. Didn't blink. This wasn't about courtroom decorum. This wasn't about neutrality. This was about power. For the first time that morning, she realized this was no ordinary trial. And she wasn't just here to argue a business case. She was about to fight a much bigger battle. The air inside the courtroom had thickened, suffocating in its silence. Judge Alan Prescott sat high on the bench, his fingers drumming against the polished wood. His expression was unreadable, but his intent was clear. This wasn't a request, it was an order. His voice cut through the stillness like a blade. "This court is neutral. You will take off that cross or face punishment." A few gasps escaped from the gallery. Others sat frozen, eyes darting between Kayleigh McEnany and the man who held the gavel. Some of the attorneys lowered their heads, unwilling to draw attention. The court clerk shifted in her seat, her gaze quickly turning to her paperwork. No one dared to challenge him. No one except Kayleigh. She didn't move, didn't flinch. Instead, she slowly folded her hands on the desk in front of her, her gaze steady, unwavering. "I will not remove it, sir." Her voice was calm, measured, but each word landed with the weight of iron. "And I will not let you overstep your authority." A beat of silence. The courtroom felt like a pressure cooker, waiting to explode. Prescott's lips thinned. His fingers, which had been tapping idly before, now curled into a fist. His irritation was growing. Kayleigh could see it in the way his nostrils flared, the way his shoulders squared just a little more. She had seen men like him before. Men who mistook authority for power, who believed their word was law, no matter how unjust. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Prescott reached for his gavel. Slam! The sound echoed like a gunshot. "Then you leave me no choice," he announced. His voice carried a clipped finality, as if he had just settled a great dispute rather than escalated it. "You are hereby fined $500 for violating courtroom neutrality." Murmurs broke out among the attorneys. A few exchanged uneasy glances. Even the bailiff looked momentarily stunned. "Kayleigh?" She merely tilted her head, a slow, almost imperceptible smirk touching the corner of her lips. "So," she said, her voice carrying across the courtroom, "you're fining me for wearing a cross?" Prescott's jaw tightened. "I'm fining you for refusing to comply with court standards." Kayleigh leaned back slightly in her chair, her fingers brushing over the small gold cross pinned neatly to her blazer. Then let's be very clear, Your Honor. She lifted her chin. You are penalizing me not for any legal misconduct, not for disrupting this court, but for silently wearing a religious symbol. Silence. Prescott's expression darkened, but she had already planted the seed. Kayleigh could feel the shift in the room. People who had been too afraid to speak now sat up straighter. A junior lawyer near the back of the courtroom scribbled something down furiously, glancing up at Prescott with a new sense of scrutiny. The judge knew what was happening, and he didn't like it. He cleared his throat sharply. "The fine stands," he said, his voice harder now. "This is no place for personal religious beliefs in a courtroom." Kayleigh exhaled slowly, deliberately. She had faced bigger battles than this, and if Judge Prescott thought this was over, he was about to learn otherwise. A slow chuckle escaped Kayleigh McEnany's lips, breaking the heavy silence in the courtroom. Judge Prescott had made a mistake. He thought this was about power, his power. But Kayleigh knew better. This wasn't a matter of opinion. It wasn't even a matter of courtroom decorum. This was the law, and she was about to remind him exactly what that meant. She reached for her briefcase, placing it firmly on the desk before her. With calm precision, she unlatched it, pulling out a neatly stacked set of documents. Legal evidence, case law, and the United States Constitution itself. She let the papers settle with a satisfying thud before looking up, her expression unreadable. "So," she said smoothly, "you want to play the law?" She tilted her head, her eyes locking onto Prescott's. "Let's talk about the law." She picked up the first document, holding it between two fingers. Tinker v. Des Moines, 1969. A murmur rippled through the attorneys seated behind her. Kayleigh continued. "In this landmark case, the Supreme Court ruled that citizens, even students, do not waive their constitutional rights when they enter a government facility." She tapped the paper. "If a 15-year-old in a public school can wear a black armband in silent protest without government interference, then I, an attorney, certainly don't lose my First Amendment rights by stepping into a courtroom." Prescott's jaw tightened. He said nothing. She reached for another document, flipping it over. "West Virginia v. Barnett, 1943, she said, her tone deliberate. The ruling was clear. The government cannot force any individual to engage in or conceal their personal beliefs. She raised a brow. "Would you like me to read the court's opinion? It's quite relevant." Prescott exhaled sharply through his nose. The courtroom was utterly still. Even the stenographer had stopped typing, her hands hovering over the keys. Kayleigh leaned forward, her gaze never wavering. "So tell me, Your Honor," she said, her voice deceptively calm, "do you really want to argue that my case is somehow different?" Prescott leaned back in his chair. His fingers tapped against the armrests, an unconscious habit to tell that she had struck a nerve. Kayleigh could see the calculation behind his eyes. He was realizing too late that he had played the wrong card. This wasn't just an arbitrary ruling. This wasn't a matter of courtroom authority. This was a constitutional fight, and he had just backed himself into a corner. Judge Prescott's lips pressed into a thin line. His grip on the gavel tightened, but Kayleigh McEnany could see it, the flicker of hesitation in his eyes. He was searching for a way out, an excuse, a justification. Finally, he exhaled sharply and spoke. "This is not a constitutional issue," he said, his voice carrying a forced authority. "This is a rule of the court." Kayleigh tilted her head slightly, studying him. There it is. The last desperate attempt to reframe the argument, to make it seem like a matter of order rather than oppression. Her voice was smooth, cutting. "Do your rules apply to those lawyers' wedding rings?" She gestured toward a man sitting at the prosecution's table, his left hand resting on a legal pad, a gleaming gold band visible. Prescott's fingers twitched. He said nothing. Kayleigh's gaze didn't waver. "Do they apply to the government badges on their lapels?" Another nod, this time toward a federal attorney in the front row, a small but distinct pin fastened to his suit, an emblem of the very system Prescott claimed to be neutral. The murmurs started, soft at first, then growing. Kayleigh leaned in, her voice steady. "Or do they just apply to my cross?" Prescott stiffened. The courtroom was shifting. A few heads turned, lawyers exchanging glances. Even the bailiff, standing stoically at the side of the room, shifted his weight slightly, aware now that this wasn't just another routine hearing. The court clerk kept her head down, fingers hovering over the keyboard, but everyone knew what was happening. Prescott was losing control. He knew it. Kayleigh knew it. And now, the entire courtroom knew it. The tension in the courtroom was razor sharp, thick enough to cut with a knife. Kayleigh McEnany let the silence stretch, watching Judge Prescott, watching the subtle tension in his shoulders, the flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. He was cornered, and he knew it. With slow, deliberate movements, she gathered her papers, stacking them neatly before rising to her feet. "Your Honor," she said, her voice steady, unwavering, "if you uphold this sentence, I will appeal." She smoothed her blazer, adjusting the gold cross still pinned proudly in place. "And when I do, this case will no longer be confined to Florida." A murmur rippled through the room. She let that statement hang, then took a step closer, her eyes locking onto Prescott's. "I believe the media," she continued, her voice low but sharp as a blade, "will be very interested in a federal judge deliberately punishing a lawyer because of her faith." Prescott's jaw tightened. His fingers twitched against the gavel. The murmurs grew louder. Everyone in the room, every attorney, every clerk, every bailiff was waiting. They weren't just watching a trial. They were watching a moment. A long, heavy pause filled the courtroom. Prescott's lips parted slightly as if he wanted to speak, but no words came out. He could see it now, his name in headlines, reporters swarming the courthouse, political figures weighing in. This wasn't just about Kayleigh anymore. This was about him, and he was losing. His grip on the gavel tightened. Then, with a short, clipped breath, he exhaled sharply and raised it. Slam! The sentence is overturned. The words fell flat, but their impact was deafening. Kayleigh stood still, unreadable, as the room absorbed what had just happened. She had won. Not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever been told to silence their faith. The courtroom doors had barely closed behind Kayleigh McEnany when the storm began. She could feel it brewing the moment she stepped out into the crisp Washington air. The murmurs among the press, the hurried whispers between reporters, the glint of urgency in their eyes. They had heard everything. One journalist in particular, a sharp-eyed reporter from a conservative news outlet, had sat quietly in the back, unnoticed, until now. By the time Kayleigh reached her office, her phone was already buzzing. Breaking news: lawyer fined for wearing cross, but she refuses to bite. The headlines spread like wildfire. A story too big to ignore. Within hours, Fox News picked it up, then CNN, then The Washington Post. Even networks that had no interest in religious freedom cases found themselves forced into the conversation. Daily Wire: judge overturned after attempt to punish attorney for her faith. Newsweek: where do we draw the line? The courtroom controversy over a simple cross. Twitter/X posts: if they can fine a lawyer for wearing a cross today, what's next? Faith under fire. Kayleigh McEnany stood her ground and won. That's how you fight back. This isn't about a piece of jewelry. It's about control, and she didn't let them have it. By morning, it was a national debate. Political commentators, legal analysts, and faith leaders weighed in. Some called it judicial overreach. Others claimed Prescott had been within his right, though their arguments rang hollow under the weight of public scrutiny. Kayleigh hadn't just won a courtroom battle. She had started something much bigger, a movement. And as she sat back watching the headlines roll in, she knew this wasn't the end. This was just the beginning. The backup: Judge Alan Prescott wasn't finished. Less than 24 hours after he overturned the fine, the Florida Bar Association issued a carefully worded statement. At first glance, it seemed neutral, just a generic reminder about courtroom professionalism. But those who read between the lines saw it for what it was: a warning. Attorneys are expected to uphold the highest standards of professionalism and respect for courtroom procedures, the statement read. Personal expressions must not disrupt the integrity of legal proceedings. Kayleigh McEnany recognized the tactic immediately. They weren't calling her out by name, but everyone knew who the message was for. The silent attack. Then came the real strike. That afternoon, a confidential complaint was filed with the Florida Bar's disciplinary board. The accusation: unprofessional conduct, disrupting courtroom proceedings. Kayleigh read the words on her screen, her jaw tightening. Disrupting? She had done nothing but defend herself, calmly, logically, within the bounds of the law. She hadn't raised her voice, hadn't broken protocol, hadn't even refused an order because there had been no legal order to refuse. Yet here she was, being painted as the problem. A system versus a person. This was no longer about one judge's overreach. This was the system closing ranks, trying to make an example out of her. She had exposed Prescott's bias. She had embarrassed him. She had turned a quiet courtroom moment into a national movement, and they weren't going to let her get away with it. She could hear Michael Carter's voice in her head, the warning he had given her after the trial. They'll try to bury you in paperwork. They'll make you fight on 1,000 different fronts until you either quit or break. But they still didn't understand. Kayleigh wasn't the type to back down. And if they thought she would go quietly, they had grossly underestimated her. If they thought she would stay quiet, they didn't know Kayleigh McEnany. She wasn't just going to fight back, she was going to flip the board. Sitting in her office, she scrolled through her contacts before pressing call. The line rang twice before a familiar voice answered. "Lisa," she said, voice steady, "I have a story that America needs to hear." Lisa Monroe had been in the journalism game for years. She wasn't the type to chase gossip or peddle half-truths. She was a veteran, one of the few who still believed in exposing real corruption, no matter where it came from. There was a pause. Then Lisa spoke. "I'm listening." Lighting the fire. Within 24 hours, the media exploded. Fox News. A judge tried to silence a lawyer. Now he's using the system to get revenge. Daily Wire. Judicial abuse? Kayleigh McEnany faces retaliation after courtroom victory. Newsweek. Free speech or professional misconduct, the controversy surrounding Kayleigh McEnany. The headlines weren't just calling out Prescott anymore. They were exposing an entire pattern, how the system protected itself, how it retaliated against those who dared to challenge it. And the people noticed. The hashtag #StandWithKayleigh trended within hours. Social media posts. They fined her for a cross, she fought back. Now they're coming for her career, not happening. The system is rigged. If they can do this to Kayleigh, they can do it to anyone. To anyone. First, it's a courtroom. Next, it's every workplace, every school. This isn't just her fight. Kayleigh sat back in her chair, scrolling through the endless flood of comments, news reports, and public statements. They had tried to bury her. Instead, they had put her on center stage. The system was used to playing chess in the dark, making quiet moves behind closed doors. But now, the board was lit up for the world to see. Judge Alan Prescott had spent years wielding his authority unchecked, making rulings from the bench with absolute confidence that no one would dare challenge him. But that was before Kayleigh McEnany, before the headlines, before the public pressure became too great to ignore. The disciplinary committee bows to public outrage. At first, the Florida Bar's disciplinary board tried to stay quiet. They ignored media inquiries, refused to comment on ongoing matters, and hoped the story would fade under the weight of the next news cycle. It didn't. Thousands of Americans flooded the board's phone lines and email inboxes. Attorneys across the country issued statements warning that allowing this case to proceed would set a dangerous precedent, one where the justice system could punish lawyers simply for existing while faithful. Under immense public scrutiny, the disciplinary committee had no choice. They announced a formal investigation. Fox News, Judge Prescott now under investigation for misconduct. Is this the start of a bigger reckoning? The Daily Wire, judicial corruption. New evidence suggests Prescott's bias in past religious cases. Social media posts. How many cases did Prescott unfairly rule on? If he did this to Kayleigh, imagine what else he's done. This isn't just about one lawyer. This is about a legal system that punishes faith. Stand with Kayleigh. Finally, someone with power is being held accountable. Let's keep the pressure on. Prescott's past comes back to haunt him. Within days, investigative reporters unearthed old rulings that painted a damning picture of Prescott's record. He had dismissed lawsuits from Christian organizations, ruled against individuals fighting for religious protections, even had ties to advocacy groups pushing for stricter neutrality policies in the judiciary. The narrative had shifted. Kayleigh was no longer the one on trial. Prescott was. Just the fall of a judge. A week later, the headlines made it official. Breaking, Judge Prescott resigns amid growing scandal. The resignation letter was brief. Prescott cited personal reasons for stepping down, but everyone knew the truth. Kayleigh McEnany had stood her ground, and the system had blinked first. The podium stood in the center of the packed auditorium, cameras flashing, microphones ready. The world was watching. Kayleigh McEnany adjusted the microphone, her fingers lightly brushing the gold cross around her neck. The same cross that had started this battle, the same one she refused to remove. She looked out at the crowd. Some were lawyers, others pastors, students, parents, ordinary Americans who had watched her fight, who saw what had been done to her and knew it could happen to them next. She took a breath, then spoke. "They think I'm just a lone lawyer." A pause. "They're wrong." The crowd erupted. Applause thundered through the room, but Kayleigh didn't smile. She wasn't here for celebration. She was here for something bigger. She raised a hand and the noise settled. "If they can punish me today," she continued, her voice strong, unwavering, "they can punish anybody tomorrow." A murmur rippled through the audience. She could see it, the realization spreading across their faces. "This isn't just about me," she said. "This is about every person who has been told to sit down, to stay silent, to hide their faith because it makes someone uncomfortable. This is about justice, and I'm not going to let them take it away." Across the country, millions of people were watching the speech live. Fox News, Kayleigh McEnany declares victory. This fight isn't over. The Daily Wire, a movement is rising. Americans push back against religious censorship. X posts. She didn't just win. She changed everything. First, they tried to silence her. Now they're scared of her. This is bigger than one trial. This is about our rights, and we're not backing down. A new movement was taking shape. Kayleigh had stepped into that courtroom alone. Now, she wasn't alone anymore. She had changed the way justice was served across the country, and this was only the beginning.